Who would we dream of funding in the privacy world? Do we think that existing laws can be applied to privacy law? How can you see what Windows is up to? Is there a way to use WhatsApp more privately? A question about alternate Monero exchanges, thoughts on Apple Intelligence and the upphone, and a suggestion about content creation guides. So many questions this week. Welcome to the Q&A 189, where we are answering questions from our amazing patrons who allow us to make this podcast for all of you. You can view and join the questions on patreon.com/surveillancepod. Last week, we only had one question, and I was away last week, so we decided just to hold off and circle back around this week, and y'all did not disappoint. You left a ton of questions, so we're going to go ahead and jump in now. Our highlight question this week comes from Parker, who says, if you could give $50 million to any project or organization related to privacy, which one would you choose and why? I kind of want to say somebody who is doing actual activism in the space, like the EFF or the Surveillance Technology Oversight Project, somebody like that who's actually like fighting for legislation, because I'll agree with the cynics in the crowd that like legislation only does so much, but it still does stuff and it's still very helpful and it still helps the general public. Even you haters that are like, well, the GDPR is not that good. Like, given the choice between America and the GDPR, I think we can agree the GDPR is better than nothing.
I was trying to be very logical about it. The problem is there's a lot of services I use and enjoy, but they already have business models, and I feel like they already are self-sufficient, and if we threw $50 million at them, they might have a lot of short-term gain, but I don't think it would ultimately change their direction at the end of the day. So I was thinking I'd probably split it up. I do think legislation, like Nate said, is good. So something like the EFF, and there's some similar organizations in Europe. Onion Share was one that came to mind because there's no ongoing maintenance costs for Onion Share itself because it's going through Tor nodes. SyncThing was another one. No like ongoing maintenance costs, but like they could really like add some cool features and like throw a lot of development behind it. F-Droid was one as well. I know especially F-Droid's been having a weird year with like the people working on F-Droid. Orbot, similar to Onion Share. And then there was only one company I felt like maybe could benefit because they have an established team, but if they just got like massive funding, it could be really awesome, would be Tuda. I think it'd be cool to see Tuda with like a massive amount of funding to see if they could roll out some of the features they want to roll out. Funny enough, I don't know, like $50 million is a lot of money, but I don't know like how far it would take an organization, which is weird to say because we constantly say like donate to open source projects because maintaining them is super important. But if you just give a massive influx of money to one project, I think it would be massively helpful. I just don't know how it would be helpful because I've never seen it.
I do want to keep this quick, but I thought about that too. It's like there's so many organizations that it's like, yeah, what would they do with that kind of money? And like you said, there's also the long-term sustainability. I think if the New Oil got $50 million, that would also give me the funding to like quit my job, focus on this full time. And by the time the money runs out, I'm already up to speed and self-sufficient. For a lot of existing bigger projects, it would probably be more of a shot in the arm than an actual like game changer like that.
I think that's a good way of putting it though. I think because a lot of these open source projects aren't people's full-time gig. And it can't be because they don't make money from it. So if they use the $50 million just to pretty much pay living expenses so they can put all their time into it, I think that would actually be a lot more impactful than anything that money can buy.
In that case, we should change the answer to like Divest OS or like, what's that one library that like the dude's from Russia? And so the whole internet almost collapsed because of sanctions. And he's like, I can't get funding anymore because everybody who donates to me is outside of Russia. That should be the answer.
All right, next question is from David Johnson. As public interest in having meaningful privacy laws increase, what do you guys think about the possibility to transfer the legal framework from the intellectual property field, like trade secrets, patents, copyright, trademarks, to privacy, as opposed to developing one from scratch? I don't feel super qualified to have much of an opinion on this. I don't know how much trade secrets, patents, copyrights, and trademarks, those laws, how well they translate to something like privacy. My guess is that privacy would have to be written pretty directly in the scope of privacy. I think that's why we've seen, I don't think the GDPR was directly taken from anything else, but correct me if I'm wrong on that. I think it had to be something started from scratch, but that's just because I feel like there's some very unique issues in the digital scape that applies to the privacy world, but maybe there aren't. Maybe there's a lot more similarities I don't know about, but that's not something I'm very qualified to know or answer. So I don't know if Nate has any other info here, but it's definitely an interesting question that I think people should think about is what would it look like if we were to propose a legal framework for this. I would rather have something developed as a framework from the GDPR, because we already have the GDPR and it's been around for a long time. And I think it's easier to improve on something that's already been done.
My answer is kind of the same as you. I'm not a lawyer in any sense of the word. I do agree. I think this is a really interesting question, and I would love to hear a qualified lawyers, because again, there's different kinds of lawyers. So someone who works in IP and or privacy and is just kind of familiar with the overlap of those, I would love to hear their thoughts on this. If we have any lawyers listening who are qualified to answer this, I would personally love to know your 2 cents. Okay, next comes from Banana, who says, in Task Manager on Windows, it shows a ridiculous amount of activity for hundreds of programs all the time. I read somewhere that Windows contacts home base over 5,000 times a day. Does Linux have the same abundance of activity in the background too? Is this just how computers work, or is this activity on Windows some kind of data collection? Let me start there. Out of the box, no, Linux should not have the same abundance of activity. Depending on which distro you go with, there may still be some telemetry, but it should not be nearly as much or nearly as invasive. It is not just how computers have to work, but it is how most of them work. In regards to network traffic, are there any programs you'd recommend to see more of what's going on in the background? Being a relative noob, I'm not sure I'd understand anything, but the hotbed of Task Manager activity got me wondering if you could see more backend into what's going on. My first thought is Portmaster from Safing. And for the record, there's other solutions out there. There's also like Simple Wall and stuff like that, or NextDNS, which are all really good options. But the reason I say Portmaster specifically is because you can literally open it up and in real time see every call that the machine is making. And then you can start blocking it just with the click of a button. You kind of have to keep a mental tally or a written tally if you want of what you've blocked, because like anyone who's messed with computers know there have been times I block things and then like 3 weeks later I'm like, why isn't this thing working? And then I go digging into Portmaster and I'm like, oh, I blocked that and I didn't realize at the time what it did. That one's really user friendly, but again, you could do Simple Wall. The only thing is Simple Wall, it's kind of like Little Snitch for Mac. It'll pop up with a pop-up that's like, hey, do you want to allow this connection through? And sometimes it's really obvious when it's like, Steam updates.exe or whatever. And it's like, okay, sure. But then other times it's like 1335J-DLL. And I'm like, maybe? I don't know. Do I want to let that through? And then again, NextDNS is kind of more like Portmaster, but you'll have to log into your DNS or the dashboard and kind of see what's going out. So those would be the 3 that I would recommend.
Yeah, I agree. Portmaster is a good tool for this. And it's on Linux too. So if you're asking, does Linux have the same abundance of activity? Boot up Linux in a virtual machine, or you can even dual boot, or you can set it up on a live OS, and you can use Portmaster on both Windows and Linux, and you can compare them side by side and see what kind of traffic you're looking at between the 2 of them. I think it's a fun experiment that you could run. And I think it really depends on just Microsoft Suite, Microsoft services. Microsoft likes to host a lot of the stuff on the web. And so as a consequence of that, there might actually be genuine reason why Microsoft has all these features that require them to contact home base constantly. But yeah, Microsoft has a lot more telemetry, and you can't get around that. And so I do think Linux is going to overall do better, but I'm sure you can also customize and use Linux in a way that would be equally damaging, but that's not the default. Next one is from Patreon. Patreon username is Patreon. So they're required to use WhatsApp for work, and it's required for day-to-day things. They know apps like Beeper act as an intermediary between WhatsApp and the user, but they know that Meta still gets all the usual metadata, and they're exposing info to Beeper. Is there any way to use Beeper or other wrappers, filters, third-party apps to make Meta not receive info about them? They found info about making a WhatsApp bridge with Matrix, but that's beyond their abilities, and they're not sure if it would actually solve the problem. Yeah, I mean, to quickly answer that, when you're using a Matrix bridge, you're still going to be having all your messages go to WhatsApp. So that's not going to really change. It might prevent you from needing to use WhatsApp on your phone. I think that would be the real benefit. Ultimately, though, I agree that if you're using Beeper, you're now also exposing info to Beeper, and you're still not dealing with the root issue with WhatsApp and Facebook. So yeah, there's really, in my eyes, no way to avoid any kind of data collection that Facebook wants to do within the WhatsApp experience. So my best bet is use WhatsApp for what you need it for, and anything that you can migrate away from WhatsApp is no longer a concern of yours. I think that's a much easier thing to accomplish. And I know it's still hard. So I'm not saying it's an easy thing to do, but I still think it's an easier goal than trying to rework how WhatsApp works to not have Meta collect data, because I just don't know how you would even go about that, because they're going to collect the metadata they want to collect inside WhatsApp.
Yeah, I think the only thing I have to add on to that is you didn't specify what OS you're on, but if you're on Android, definitely look into like other user profiles or like the shelter. We talked about that a couple episodes ago, work profiles, either OS, Android or iOS. Be sure to check the permissions, disable any that aren't required. Just be mindful of your usage, who you talk to and all that. I don't think you can technically link WhatsApp to desktop, not in the same way that you can with Signal. I'm pretty sure it's one of those like kind of like more like Threema, like you have to leave the app running. It might be web-based, so trying to use it on desktop may not necessarily be feasible. At this point, you're kind of in a tough situation where you don't have a lot of choice, which I totally understand. You kind of have to look at this point for like harm reduction. Like you're not going to find a perfect solution. What's the least worst option here? Our next question comes from Yaya. Now that local Monero has shut down, have you tried Haveno Retro for buying Monero? It's very new, so I guess a lot of people want some evidence it's legitimate. Do you trust it? What do you think of its security and privacy? If you haven't tried it, would you consider trying it? I haven't tried it. I'm really not super plugged into the cryptocurrency community, to be totally honest. I'll just leave it at that. I don't know if it's legit. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. I would ask someone who's more plugged in. I guess I wouldn't be opposed to checking it out. I don't know when I'll get around to that, but I'm not against it.
Haveno is a decentralized exchange, similar vibe to Bisq, that has an emphasis on Monero. I think it's actually a fork of Bisq, but it's Monero first instead of Bitcoin. Yeah, it's open source, and they just hit V1 in the last couple months. It's considered pretty trustworthy, and people are really excited for it, and people overall in the community see this as like the next local Monero. In fact, I just pulled up Alex. So Alex is the person who ran local Monero. In the original PSA of when Alex announced local Monero is winding down, they even said the Monero ecosystem has matured a lot over these years, and with the imminent launch of Haveno and other DEXs like Sarai, Atomic Swaps, and the coming edition of FCMP. So pretty much like they almost shout out Haveno as a really cool development in the space that they're excited for. So if you trusted local Monero, Alex, the person who ran local Monero, even was excited for Haveno reaching V1. I haven't tried it, so I can't speak to if it's good. I can't speak to how well it works. Just be careful that you're getting it from official sources, because I know there's a lot of spam ones that might try to steal your money right now. It's very new and it's pretty early on. So I wouldn't expect it to be the best user experience yet. But I think it's overall like a trusted way to get it if you do it reliably. Next question's from Skolt, and it's in regards to implementation of Apple Intelligence. Do you hold the same thoughts on iPhone being a good option for an entry phone that doesn't require flashing? Yeah, I'd say the way I'd answer this is nothing that Apple announced with Apple Intelligence makes me recommend the iPhone more or less, because you don't even need to use the features. So it's like most things with the iPhone, a lot of the privacy invasive features on the iPhone are things that myself and Nate would probably already tell you to disable and just not use. And actually, Jonah and I talked about this more on the newest Techlore Talks, so I'd check that out if you want to. But we talk about Apple Intelligence and some of the privacy precautions they did implement. And even things that are third party that don't have very much privacy, like ChatGPT, you have to opt in to use it not just once, but every time you use it. So this isn't something you're going to accidentally use. So no, I have concerns about Apple Intelligence, don't get me wrong, but they're very like isolated concerns within the Apple Intelligence issue. They don't change much of my viewpoint of iOS as a whole. I still think iOS is not a terrible platform for people to be on, especially compared to things like stock Android, which have its own issues. But I do think, especially like other non-stock versions of Android, I think those are what you really want to avoid. So I still go back to, I think iOS, stock Android are two really solid recommendations for people who aren't looking to flash anything. I don't know anything about this unplugged phone. It sounds scammy.
Yeah, it is. So I went and just looked it up. So for those who are listening, this was a two-part question. Part one was aimed directly at Henry, and the second one was at both of us. Do you have any thoughts on the unplugged up phone? Never heard of it, so I went and looked it up. I'm getting very strong Freedom Phone vibes, but less political, slightly less political, because it runs the Libert OS. It has the Up VPN, Up Messenger, Up Antivirus. What else? And I can't find anything about the hardware of the phone. It kind of looks like an iPhone, to be honest with you.
It's funny. I was looking at Signal. I thought that it was in our new Signal chat that we just released for SR that people asked about it, but it was in the Techlore one. Someone just asked about this. There's actually a thread on the Techlore forum that talks about the unplugged phone. Some people are criticizing it in our forum. The app is illegally stolen from DivestOS. They apparently just stole DivestOS code for the antivirus.
I wondered that. I wondered because I was looking at like the Messenger and I was like, so is this a fork of Matrix? Because I'm looking at it, it's clearly not iOS, but it's also not quite like obviously Android, like not in the same way that you would use like, and I don't mean this as a slight on anyone obviously, but like when you load Calyx or Divest and you look at it and you're like, oh, this is obviously Android. Like you don't, or Lineage, I should say. I've never used Divest, but like Lineage and Calyx, it's like, this is obviously Android. This doesn't quite obviously look like Android, but it looks much closer than it does to iOS. So sorry, continue.
Yeah. And the same thing, they're just using Matrix for their like messenger.
For the LibreOS?
I think so. Their web chat client, web.unplugged.com, is just Matrix. So like it's just rebranded things that you can use by yourself, and they just add this really sketchy, weird company in the mix that might be able to see more than you want them to see. So
I don't see a single reason to use this, to be honest with you, when we already have, like every once in a while we'll see one of these things where I'm like, I could see why somebody might be interested in this, but this is one of those things, which most of them are, where it's like, we have Calyx, we have Lineage, we have Divest, we have so many other good options out there that have been vetted, that have a good reputation, that we know, as you point out, we know who's behind them. I don't know anything about this company. They're not being weirdly, these other ones are usually not being weirdly dog whistly and political.
they also don't deny it. Like they don't mind saying, oh, this is a fork from this and this is using XYZ.
Yeah, like even EOS will admit that they're like using Lineage, you know. We're going to wrap this up with our last one comes from Cracker Barrel Biscuits. So this isn't a question, but I wanted to publicly address it. You said, I wanted to make a suggestion for an interesting video or even series, an in-depth guide on how to be a large YouTuber and remain private and secure. I don't know anything about being a large YouTuber, but you say there's probably a lot of overlap with the general population, and there's also probably a lot of up-and-coming content creators who could benefit from something like that. We've seen the consequences of swatting or trolls harassing your family and friends. I do not have an in-depth guide, but on The New Oil, if you go to the front page, just thenewoil.org, and you scroll to the bottom, you'll see quick start guides. And most of those guides link to existing pages that you would normally find just by navigating the bar on the side, the sidebar, navigation bar, whatever. But I do have two, and specifically here, the one is content creators. That'll take you to a page that's not listed in the navigation bar. It's designed to be, because a couple years ago, mostly during lockdown and shortly thereafter, I had a lot of people coming to me and saying like, I want to be a content creator. They would basically like, how can I do this in a privacy respecting way that I'm not going to get doxxed and lose my job and whatever. And I made this page specifically for people who want to be a content creator of any kind, with basic information about like, consider using an alias, make sure you secure your accounts, et cetera, et cetera. So it's not really in depth, and some of it does link to other sections on the website, but it's designed to be a standalone page that you can send to literally anyone and be like, hey, you want to be a content creator? Here's some stuff to keep in mind. I would say just go check that page out, and that'll probably get you started at least.
Yeah, I don't have much to add to that. Yeah, we don't have a video on it, but I'd say the main area where this has come up is it's very similar. I don't think I've worked with specifically YouTubers, but with like kind of the private coaching I do with some very select clients, it's been like typically like people who work in public. It wouldn't be any different for creators is my point, because they work in things like news and like CEOs and things like that. And so yeah, there are people who have a little bit more public facing personas, and there are people who care a lot more about security than privacy, because a lot of what they do is public. Of course, they want privacy though in their personal life. That's typically where you see like the strong desire for privacy. And so that's where I've seen a lot of it. And creators wouldn't be too different, with the exception of creators might have a lot more of their life online, depending on what they're doing. I reasonably just don't think it's possible for like a vlogger to actually maintain a lot of privacy if they're a vlogger who's vlogging everything about their life every day. That's where things get a little difficult. It's definitely interesting. I've worked with a couple of people who tried to set up a podcast, and it was pretty similar, I think, to the creator thing. But I think the big thing people always need to make a decision on before they start is the face situation. If you want to show your face, if you want to make it yourself, your identity, I feel like you can only get so far if you show your face in terms of hiding your identity from the public.
Those were all the questions we had this week, a lot of them, but thank you guys for asking. So our thoughts on who we would fund if we had $50 million to give away, thoughts on existing laws and how they might be adaptable for privacy, how to see what Windows is up to, how to use WhatsApp more privately, the Haveno Monero exchange, Apple Intelligence, the Up phone, and again, a suggestion about content creation. So thank you guys again for tuning in. Again, a lot of questions this week, but we really appreciate you guys. They're always fun to ask. They expose us to new ideas. They challenge us to think outside the box and what we would do in that situation. So yeah, really, really cool stuff. We're really happy to answer these questions, and we appreciate your support in return. If you are not already on Patreon and you want to join the Q&A, or you just want to support us, again, you can do that by joining patreon.com/surveillancepod. And just as a reminder, as Henry mentioned, we now have a Signal group for patrons, and that starts at the $5 level. So you can ask questions, you can join the Signal group, other like-minded people. We're in there. I know we're kind of busy throughout the day, so we're in and out, but we're in there as well. We're keeping an eye on things, so we'll respond sometimes. Good Q&A this week, and stay tuned this weekend for Surveillance Report 190.